You're tuned in to Women in America, the podcast that dives deep into the issues shaping gender equality in the US and beyond. Hosted by Pari and Eve, public health professionals by day and content creators by passion, we bring you expert insights and actionable strategies to push the fight for equality forward in today's America. On this episode of Women in America, we chat with lifelong political resistor Beth Green on the potluck revolution and the connection between community and burnout. Let's dive in. For those of us who work in reproductive health, like Eve and myself, or frankly for anyone who simply cares about basic freedoms, it's hard to not know what happened in the summer of 2022. After Trump's appointed SCOTUS judges gave the conservative part of the Supreme Court a majority, those judges came for Roe via the Dobbs decision, and they undid the federal right to privacy, which included accessing an abortion. In the years after the fall of Roe in 2022 and beyond, the Republicans were preparing for the 2024 election. And in those 2 years, they made abortion bans and reproductive health care one of the central platforms of the election, right? Anyone who was in the US at that time or paying attention to the US at that time or voting in the US at that time knew that when it came to reproductive rights, one party was a no and one party was a yes. The thing is, Republicans realized over time that their focus on abortion and reproductive health was a losing issue for them. They saw time and time again in local elections how being on the wrong side of history, being anti-bodily autonomy, being anti-choice cost them elections, cost them cultural shifts, cost them people who were previously loyal to that party. And so you might think that because we have stopped hearing about abortion and reproductive health as incessantly since the 2024 election, that they have backed off. Turns out all they've done is become smarter about being silent about it. Fast forward to now in 2025, the Republicans hold power in the three branches of government, the presidency, the House, and the Senate. And rather than hear what the American public has been telling them, they have doubled and in fact tripled down on their baseless attacks on reproductive health. And in their most recent attack on reproductive rights, they're targeting, you guessed it, veterans. If you haven't heard, the Department of Veterans Affairs, which I will from now on call the VA, has recently revised their rules around abortion provision to their patients who are veterans. In 2022, after Roe fell, the VA revised their regulations to only provide abortion care within specific provisions, 4 provisions to be exact. The first was cases of rape. The second was cases of incest. The third was if the health of the pregnant person was at risk. And the fourth exception was when the life of the pregnant person was at risk. Now, in 2025, with these new regulations, the VA is getting rid of the first 3 of those 4 stipulations, which means that someone would only be able to access abortion care at the VA if their life was at risk. Now, when it comes to exceptions, the data has shown us time and time again that they do not work, that the practical implementation of exceptions is simply that people die. The ProPublica report that came out in 2024 collected data from states with abortion bans, and it focused specifically on Georgia because Georgia was the very first state to implement an abortion ban in 2019. 2 stories from that ProPublica report went massively viral and in fact became part of the presidential campaign runs, those of Candy Miller and Amber Thurman, both Georgia women who lost their lives as a direct result of doctors not providing them care because of fear of retribution because of existing abortion bans in the state. I bring up Candy and Amber to show that we have definitive proof, in fact, mountains of it, that provisions for exceptions simply do not work in practical implementation. And even though we know they don't work, the truth is that we have been normalized as a country to accept the absolute bare minimum. In fact, the bar is not just in hell, it is underneath hell, because we used to be an environment, a country, a context that valued human rights, where women were seen as equal citizens, where the bodily autonomy of an individual was up to that individual. And now instead we debate semantics and specifics and determine how far along someone has to be towards death before we decide that we are going to cater to their basic healthcare needs. We have seen repeatedly in the Supreme Court case that came out of Idaho, where prosecutors were arguing about which organs were feasible enough for women to lose before they qualified for basic healthcare. So here's my question to you. As you listen to this episode, ask yourself, we are reached a point where we are now fighting even for the inclusion of basic exceptions, when what we should be doing is accepting that any person wanting an abortion for any reason at all is in fact valid and well within their human rights to do so. Even I have been speaking about this phenomenon with several experts in the field. And it is challenging for all of us to see how society is normalizing these absolute bare minimum situations and debating about whether, in fact, we should allow someone who has been sexually assaulted to even access abortion care, because that is what the GOP and the Republicans have normalized for us. And now they're going after veterans who've put their lives on the line, who've made sacrifices, compromises, taken time away from their lives and family to stand up and protect our freedoms and our country. And now that those veterans are back home, trying to access care at the exact facilities that were designed for them to do so, those veterans are not able to access basic freedoms at home. And every one of us needs to stand up to this tyranny and fight back by saying absolutely the fuck not. To help equip you to do that, today I'd like to introduce you to Christina Chang, the Executive Director of the Reproductive Freedom Alliance. RFA is a bipartisan organization that is a collective of 23 governors across states who are combining forces to fight for reproductive freedom. Across those 23 states, 400,000 women vets are going to be affected by this decision. And these 23 governors are stepping up to say, absolutely the fuck not. I spoke with Christina about how RFA has been working to tackle all of these attacks and, frankly, the many more that exist in our society today. And I want to share with you what she said. Christina, thanks so much for speaking with me today. They're coming for the VA now in terms of policy, but what happens at the VA is not staying at the VA, and it is not mutually exclusive from everything else that has been going on in the country. So, in your experience working with these governors and now trying to directly combat this restriction that's coming into play at the VA, could you speak a little bit to did that happen overnight? Or did you see it coming because of all of these cultural shifts that are being created with policy and language and narrative and so on?
It's such an important question. I mean, I think we have been seeing this shift. It's been a very intentional since Roe was established as and put this sort of federal protection in there, right? There has been this steady erosion that we're seeing state after state and in state house after state house and until we finally came to the culmination of this. And it comes from some of these it's it is a death by a thousand cuts, as you're saying. The VA, we talked about that. This is actually it was a very small expansion, and they're trying to tighten even that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's actually a really small example. It's not even talking about these larger attacks and threats that we see in terms of that have even higher impact, for example, on the total misinformation that we see trying to put into to question the safety and effectiveness of medication abortion, and despite hundreds of studies and decades of evidence that show that it's safe, effective, option for people who are seeking abortion care. This coordinated move, both at the federal level but state by state, to restrict that access to care, and so that's just another example. So I think there is this steady march, and I think that's why it's so important for governors to come together to be able to counter that from a narrative perspective, to be able to put this in the context, reproductive freedoms in the context of all of the freedoms that we have,
Mm-hmm.
that, as you mentioned, in the last 8 months, feel like they're under attack, right, from all directions. The importance that we are coming together and using all of these tools to combat, not just and to be able to protect access within these states for the people who live there and the people who are coming now are forced to come to seek care in those states because they can't get it at home. And I think that you talked about these heartbreaking, completely preventable situations where people are at death's door, or unfortunately, we're seeing. I mean, this is it's not hyperbole to say that people are literally dying because doctors are put into a position where they're not able to provide the care that they're trained to do, and do what they do what got them into healthcare and medicine in the first place. And so, where the governors are trying to do in the alliance is thinking about ways that we can protect that care, but then also be able to expand it, be able to expand different access points, be able to allow different kinds of providers to offer care, to facilitate telehealth. All of those governors are coming together to try to share that. And you mentioned a number of others. I'll just put in a little plug for the expansion of like the idea of like this collective work that governors can do. I think that the Reproductive Freedom Alliance sort of has proof of concept about how important this collaboration is across states. And so they're actually one of the founding drivers and people behind the Reproductive Freedom Alliance have now launched the Governors Action Alliance, and that is a platform across different issues. And so they, right now there's in addition to the Reproductive Freedom Alliance, there's Governors Safeguarding Democracy, which are looking at a lot of the threats that we're seeing around immigration and mass deportation, around federalization of the National Guard or attempts to do so. All of these threats to our democracy as well. So just a departure from reproductive health, but to be able to show that that we are uniting across states on a range of different issues through the Reproductive Freedom Alliance.
I agree with you 100%, and I'm also going to push back slightly. The only thing I disagree with is that defending all of our freedoms is a departure from reproductive health, because as you know, and as I know, reproductive autonomy cannot exist without other autonomy, right? I understand why you said it that way, because you're right. From like a policy perspective, there is a difference. But unfortunately, I think the reason we have reached that point is because we've had several people push us to the point where now we have to think about them separately because everything is under attack. When, let's say 20 years ago, there was not such a distinction between things, right? And like women weren't only, or like folks with uteruses weren't only considered because of their capacity to reproduce. There was also like their freedom to exist, their freedom to travel, all of these things that still exist but are all now under attack. So one, I think it's honestly commendable and speaks to your values as an organization that you are tackling these multiple things because you see people as holistic individuals as opposed to just one element of them. But I think what I would also love to hear from you is, we've been talking about a few different policies, so I'll recap for folks. Currently, the VA, because of a restriction placed in 2022, only affords abortion care to vets under cases of rape, incest, health risk, or life risk. And the VA is now proposing a new restriction that is removing the first three of those and only keeping in place the life-saving provision, which, as we've all seen, does not really hold true in reality or practical implementation, because we've lost several individuals over the course of the last 3 years to these bans because doctors feel like they're both gagged from speaking about something and also essentially have their hands cuffed and not able to provide the care. I wanted to know, Christina, have you also been engaging perhaps with vets to hear like what kind of mobilization is happening amongst that population, or is RFA mostly involved in like the legislative political advocacy at the state level?
All policy is rooted in in response to the experiences and trying to address the problems that come up. And so I think that across the board, governors are, talking to and trying to learn from the experience of those who are going to be most impacted. So they are, I think, hearing from different groups that are representing veterans. I think that, the fact that there were 24,000 comments that were submitted to this proposed rule shows, how the voices of those who are experiencing the impacts of these potential changes are making their voices, making their experiences known. And being able to feed into what our policy responses are. And so I think that governors are taking that very seriously. Their staff are always listening to their constituents and to the communities that they're trying to serve at Freedom. attack for them. And I agree with you about like just your point that you were saying that about the interconnectedness of this, and that reproductive freedom is, or reproductive health care, and that access is one case case study, right, about these intersections around access to care, about how it's so fundamental. The decisions that we could be making on our lives is fundamental, and I think that it shows up for reproductive freedom as just one example of what is fundamental for us to be able to have agency over our bodies and our lives, and be able to, I think, be able to make the decisions so that we can thrive and our communities can thrive.
Yes, 100% agree. RFA has been responding to this new restriction that has come out at the VA through, action that the 23 governors have collectively taken together. Could you tell me a little bit about what that looks like, how you went about getting that started? Simply because while, while the average person is not a governor, I think it's uplifting for folks to hear that there is like this really collective action, and that folks like Newsom or whomever, the other 22 governors are, that they're thinking about more than just their state lines, right? And I think that that is helpful. So I would love to hear from you about how the letter action came about. And then second, what you anticipate might come off that action.
When the proposed rule came out, we meet regularly and convene regularly with our Reproductive Freedom Alliance states, and it was almost immediate. Like everyone says, like this is an outrage, right? That this is happening. What can we be doing as a group? And it was a very natural response to say we want to be able to submit comments and be able to tell the story about why this is and how this is impacting veterans in our states, and we want to do it in a collective way too, right? So states have talk about the individual sort of impacts that are happening, whether it's in California or North Carolina or Massachusetts, and as well as how it like is impacting them across the board. And so, I think they said like we submitted formal comments through the process, and then they also wanted to like put their names behind each of the governors wanted to put their names behind it and reach out directly to Secretary Collins. The dangerous sort of situations they're setting up, and the restrictions that they're seeing from this imposed rule, and the impacts that it has. And so, it was very, we've done other sorts of collective actions across governors before. During the Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine Supreme Court case that was around involving medication abortion, the governors all filed an amicus brief in support of medication abortion, mifepristone, in particular, safe and available and accessible to people. So there have been other instances. They have written letters to pharmacy chains when they were able to encourage them to carry and dispense mifepristone. When that was allowed, and sort of like being able to use that. So there's a lot of examples of how they're using their collective voice to do that.
Basically, what I heard you describe is essentially like mutual aid and support between these governors, right? Like we as in the royal we, talk about the need for coalition building within progressive spaces, and we only think about that at a grassroots level. But what you're doing with RFA is like coalition building and mutual aid across states, which is so unfortunately necessary at times like this, right? And I think that there's like a real power in that I think people need to clue into is like, when even I talk about things even other than repro, we talk about climate justice or immigrant protections, all of these things, there's often this like vibe within our comments, within the discourse that we receive is like, well, red states and blue states have a totally different way of dealing with that. And I think that while we are working on the much larger systems that allow people's votes to be more equitable regardless of where they live, there's such a need for this idea of like, okay, let's allow like the folks who all are on one side of this to be able to come together in their collective power and make change for people that live within their states, right? So I just wanted to point out that I really appreciate that there is, an organization that is explicitly doing that, to say like, okay, we're going to take the like resources and infrastructure that
a state like California has and combine that with the resources and infrastructure that a smaller state like, let's say, Rhode Island has. And the idea is that it's mutually beneficial. It allows there to be this like community within what seems like a vacuum of very loud anti-choice voices, right? So just want to express gratitude to you for, first of all, coordinating an effort like that, because I imagine it can't be easy, especially given like the constant attacks that are coming.
Governors they're like they're the chief executive of the state, right? They have extraordinary, authority and powers. They control budgets. They sign legislation. They have executive authority over agencies, and so they can do regulation. They can do executive actions like executive orders. They can use the bully pulpit as well, right? And use their platform to be able to get accurate information out there to people about how they can access services. So there's an enormous toolbox they can use every day in every way to make their lives better. I think that what is really unique about RFA is that it creates this platform for governors then who are like-minded and looking at similar goals to not be acting in isolation from each other. A way for them to be able to coordinate, collaborate, to share best practices, to problem solve together, so that they can sort of be able to innovate together and then bring those things to scale.
There you have it, folks. That was Christina Chang, the Executive Director of the Reproductive Freedom Alliance. I specifically wanted to introduce you to her work with RFA because I think it really emphasizes the importance of state and local elections in dealing with these issues that might seem like they can only be impacted federally. RFA is doing the work at a state level and really combining collective power across states of governors. And like I said in my chat with her, while we might not all be governors, there are actually things that a lot of us can do. Christina and I wrapped up our conversation by talking about the actions that every average American can be taking to combat this specific attack against the VA. The first one was making public comment on these proposed changes to the VA regulations on the regulations.gov website. Even I shared that call to action in our socials last week. The second is to amplify organizations like RFA. One of the things that is hard about being in the business of caring about people at a time where it feels like our lawmakers don't, is that every time we give people a call to action or we share a piece of news or we share an update, it just feels like it's bad news, that it's this horrible thing that we're about to tell you to do. So this time, I actually have a very happy piece of action for you. When I say amplify the work of organizations like RFA, what I mean is that there are 23 governors coming together across states to fight back against this horrible regulation simply because they believe that women should have human rights, that it is a right thing to do, and that they should be leveraging their collective power to do this. So I think that you should go ahead and tell these 23 governors, especially if they're one of your governors, thank you. And I think that could be as simple as tweeting at them or, sending them a little note or calling their office. All of that helps. It is rare for our lawmakers to receive positive encouragement, and this is an opportunity to do that. Another way to support organizations like RFA is if you are able to give towards the causes that they're supporting or to the organizations themselves. So when it comes to combating this new regulation that the VA is proposing, those are 3 actions that you can take today to try and stop. So get cracking and let's stand up for our vets like they've stood up for us. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Women in America. If you enjoyed it, share it with your network and follow us on social media at women_in America. See you next week.